On today's Locked On Jayhawks, season is over. A lot of decisions to be had. What are the biggest offseason decisions for KU?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. We are free and available anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page, wherever you get that for free. And on today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we are breaking down the biggest offseason decisions for KU men's basketball now that the season is in the books, I guess you could say. So let's discuss some of the big things that are to be had for KU. First, this episode brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. So we're going to start with, I guess, where KU is at in the scholarship situation, player decisions to come for KU. I think some Bill Self decisions to come for KU, and then we'll finish up with some KU women's basketball talk as they're getting ready to play their second-round matchup with USC in the NCAA tournament there. Let's start with the scholarship talk. I think basically there are questions about how many scholarships does KU have. If you remember the NCAA sanction stuff, KU had to knock out 3 scholarships over the course of 3 seasons, right? So they could have knocked out 1 a year over 3 years. They could have knocked out 2 in 1 year, 1 in another, 0 in another. They could have done 3 all in 1 year. It's a little murky, a little unclear what the case is here for Kansas. Kansas had 10 scholarship players on their roster. They had the 9 who we knew who were players, and then the 10th was Zach Clements, who was redshirting this year, which means you get 13 scholarships in basketball. That's 10 scholarship players. You would have burnt all 3 scholarships in 1 year, meaning that you would be flush on the NCAA punishment and theoretically be able to have the next 2 years at full scholarship. However, the undetermined factor in all this is, what does the Arterio Morris one count as? Did, by bringing him on and enrolling him in school, did that count enough as the scholarship to where it counts as you had 11 scholarship players, and therefore you would have used up 2 of the 3, and that you still have to not utilize 1 of your scholarships then at that point over the next 2 seasons? You could pick whether you would want to not use that scholarship this year or whether you'd want to not use that scholarship next year. But that's only if Morris does count to the scholarship count, which I don't think we've gotten clarity if that is the case or not. If he doesn't count to the scholarship numbers, then Kansas is good to go moving forward, and they can bring in 13 scholarship guys moving forward each and every year. One thing is for sure, when you're looking at these decisions for KU basketball, there's basically one known commodity, I feel like, for next year's KU team, and that would be DeJuan Harris. He's already posted on social media, back for next year. That's been the expectation all the way through from the start of the year to the end of the year, that DeJuan Harris will be back for one final ride at Kansas next year. And that, again, is going to be the thing. But outside of that, it's a lot of murky water. Now, Kansas can return a lot of the other players. Theoretically, among the scholarship players, the only players that you would be losing, Kevin McCullough has to go. He's exhausted his eligibility. And Parker Brown has to go. He's exhausted his eligibility as well. Theoretically, you could bring everybody back. As we know, in the transfer portal era, that's just unlikely to happen on any given team to begin with. But then there are also professional decisions for some KU players. Let's start with those. Johnny Furphy has a real decision to make here for Kansas, because Furphy is being seen as a first-round draft pick. He obviously had the tough finish to the regular season over his final 5 games of the regular season plus the Big 12 tournament. Played pretty well. Numbers went back up in the NCAA tournament. And, yeah, there's a few things you can still critique here or there, but he did enough to kind of bounce back up in the right way. And in a very weak draft class, which this absolutely is, a team would very much be willing to use a first-round draft pick on Johnny Furphy. And this becomes the old, common debate of, well, what is the best time to enter the NBA draft? Is it when you are most ready? Is it when you're going to get your draft stock at the absolute highest? I think that's kind of the big one that I mostly go to. Like, when is your draft stock at the highest? I think theoretically you could convince me Furphy comes back and he is KU's best player next year, and he's a All-American, and he could be a top 10 pick, a lottery pick. This year, maybe he could still be a lottery pick, though, just because of how bad the draft is. So you can make the argument that the stock's never going to be higher, though. I don't know, maybe he's supposed to go in the 20s more this year, and maybe with a good year he comes back and he could be a lottery pick. Then again, if you come back and you're the same guy as you were next year as you are this year, but just adding a little bit more, then your draft stock starts to drop a little bit because it's like, oh, you're not rapidly ascending. And that's what we're going to see because you're drafting a lot of times off potential in the NBA. So there is that kind of question of what's best for him. There's also the question of the adage of development question, right? Because you hear all the time, okay, he'll develop more in college. Well, why can't he develop in the NBA? He's going to be a paid professional. That's going to be his job 24/7 to work on basketball. Theoretically, he's going to get better at basketball being a paid professional to do so in the NBA than college. I do think there are some certain things you maybe can develop better in college, like you maybe can develop being the alpha in college, right? If you go into a situation where you're the 12th guy off the bench in an NBA team, it's going to be a little bit harder to develop being the guy, right? Now, then again, in a guy like Johnny Furphy's case, is he more going to profile into being a role player anyway in the NBA? So there's all those discussions that need to have happen. But I do think this is very much a 50-50 coin flip because I do feel like from Furphy's perspective, probably went into the season and probably through December into January, the whole conversation for Furphy and probably his family was, oh, yeah, we'll be at Kansas another year. And then he has this blow up to where it is more of a late thing that has happened, that it does feel like more of a coin flip, whether he is going to come back or go. Maybe if I was leaning one way or another, maybe I would lean just slightly that he goes pro just because, like I said, maximizing your draft stock, it's a bad draft and everything. But you could convince me either one of them certainly happens. Hunter Dickinson has the other big decision here for KU. He can come back another year because his first year in college was the first year back from the COVID year, and so it didn't really count. So next year would be his fifth year in college, but he does have that ability in terms of the COVID year. You heard his post game after the game at the podium, and he was so thankful and appreciative of his time at Kansas this year and enjoyed everything he got to do. From that standpoint, you would certainly think, okay, this guy really enjoyed it. It's not like he's unhappy to be here. Why not come back another year? There's also the NIL factor where Hunter Dickinson is making a lot of money off of NIL. And when you look at the draft prospects, 20 years ago, Hunter Dickinson might be a first-round draft pick. But in today's day and age, when it has transitioned so much to versatility and mobile big men and, big men who can dribble and drive and pass and initiate offense and all this stuff, that you have all these freaky 7-footers who are just doing unbelievable things. Dickinson, okay, we saw the pick and roll defense, the spacing issue on defense come into play in the Gonzaga game. Now try doing that in an NBA game with even better athletes and even wider spacing on the court and no 3 seconds in the key, like you can do and get away with in college, to where he's not going to be a drafted player. And so from that standpoint, if you're Hunter Dickinson, he can probably make a killing overseas in Europe. He can probably have a long career in the G League, maybe have a cup of coffee in the NBA or something like that. But are you in a rush to get there? I guess basically is what I'm saying, to where you can make, 7 figures playing at Kansas next season. If you're playing in the G League, what are you going to be making? You're making $100,000, $200,000, right? Like, that's still a good living to play basketball, but wouldn't you rather bank the $1 million at Kansas? So I don't know, maybe this one comes into play a little bit where Bill Self is like, hey, we don't want to play with 2 bigs anymore. And that'll bring us to my next guy that we have the decision on here, because I kind of want to lump these together a little bit. KJ Adams. I think this kind of becomes a bit of a Bill Self decision, because from KJ's perspective, same thing as Hunter Dickinson. Like, neither guy, if they entered the NBA draft, is getting drafted. Now, maybe there's an opportunity for one of the two that, yeah, they get a camp invite, or they get, maybe they can work their way into 2 ways an undrafted player. But, that's not even a guarantee either for either one of those guys. And so from that standpoint, it becomes, okay, if you both have 1 more year left to play, then you're clearly coming back. Or do you transfer to go to a better situation, or maybe not better is the right word because you're at Kansas, but a different situation that is more suited to, what you want to do? Because from Bill Self's perspective, like, do you tell both these guys, hey, we can only have one of you back? Because 2 big basketball didn't really work for us this year. It doesn't work in this day and age of college basketball where you have, somebody who can be a non-shooter playing 2 bigs next to each other. And so we can only have one of you guys back. If it was up to me to choose, I'm taking KJ, and I'm rolling with a 5-man spot of rotating KJ Adams and Flory Badunga. If you are in a matchup where you need a more traditional big, okay, Flory, go out there. If you're in a matchup where you want to switch 5 and you're playing a team who's going to shoot really well from 3, and you can switch 1 through 5 and now be a good perimeter defense, and you can throw lobs to KJ in the middle and, have that on offense with a bunch of guards around him on the offensive side, that makes it a lot of fun. then yeah, you throw KJ in those matchups. That would be my preference because I think it gives you a higher ceiling and a higher floor on the defensive end, even though it lowers your floor on the offensive end. But it actually keeps your ceiling high enough because you can still supplant around him on the offensive end of the court. But I do think the decision could come down to that, or it could come down to, if both guys come back, hey, are you more comfortable coming off the bench? Or are you more comfortable? We'll start you, but we're going to only play 10 minutes of KJ and Hunter next to each other. And then you'll get your another 10 minutes being the backup to Hunter. We'll play him, 30 minutes a night and this and that. But if you're one of those players, if you're KJ, or you like, well, I'd rather just go here and play 30, 35 minutes a night. If you're Hunter Dickinson and Bill Self says, hey, I want to go to more of a defense system, like you should go fight somewhere else. What if transfer somewhere else? So both those decisions are a little bit on Bill Self, but both those decisions are part of themselves as well, even though neither one is really a true NBA decision in the same way that Johnny Furphy is. And then, like I said, anybody else really does have a decision to make because we are in a day and age of college basketball where you don't know if any player is really coming back or not. And now with the unlimited transfer rule, you really don't know even as you get closer to the season. Hypothetically, player could stick around staying, and then all of a sudden in camp in August or something when school starts, player could be like, yeah, it looks like I'm the third guard on the depth chart. I'm piecing. I'm getting out of here. I'm transferring. And no NCAA rule could stop that. So in reality, every player has a decision, but those are kind of the main ones for KU for obvious reasons. All right, let's continue on. What decisions does Bill Self have to make on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks? This week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest, just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The Arizona Wildcats can only be described as an armada. This 2 seed is as hardcore as it gets. They've got all sorts of athletes, all sorts of great scoring guards. Could you imagine if, this was a very controversial one in the transfer portal in the offseason. Should Kansas have taken Caleb Love? Well, turns out Caleb Love ended up winning Pac-12 Player of the Year and would have been just exactly what Kansas needed, a guard who could create his own shot. So it's no wonder that they took down Long Beach State in the first round, crushed them, and then cruised to a 10-point win over Dayton in round 2. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure with Nissan. We're also brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That is $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. You can use it on point spreads, money lines. You can pick a future. Who's going to win it all? Who's going to make the Final Four? Who's going to win Final Four MOP? You want to get into baseball? Hey, KU's out. You're like, you know what? Forget this. I'm moving on to the Royals season. You can pick them to win the AL Central or whatever you want to do. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Continue on with Locked On Jayhawks. Thank you to being every dayer out there. Trust me, we will still continue on. The season has ended for KU. Season has not ended for us because, as we know, the transfer portal is rampant, and we're going to have plenty of content to discuss in the offseason. So make sure you subscribe to the show and tune in each and every day. We will have some transfer portal targets at different positions coming for you later this week. So don't worry. Be on the lookout for that one. Okay, build self-decisions. The first one here becomes who to show the door to. And maybe the answer is no one. Honestly, that would be my preference because, well, I guess first things first. There are sometimes where players transfer on their own accord. There's sometimes players transfer because they want more playing time or they want more this and that. Obviously, at a place like Kansas, it's kind of in a weird spot because you bring in a lot of really good players that are ranked really highly in high school or, played really big minutes at their previous college stop and think they are good players, and for the most part they are good players, right? And so there's expectations from them of I want to play a lot. Then again, there's also the aspect where Kansas really takes care of their players, both in terms of facilities and place to live and NIL money and all that sort of stuff that, it's not a bad life being an 8th man, being a 9th man, 10th man, 11th man, whatever it is on a Kansas roster and being content with that and having a nice NIL chunk of change and everything like that. So it is kind of that weird spot. But with showing the door, we've seen this in the past where it's more so been a thing by Kansas to be like, hey, I'm going to have these exit meetings with these guys. I got to be honest, you're not going to play next year. We're bringing in this guy. We have this guy coming back, and we're also adding this freshman, and we like them all better than you. So if you want to come back, that's fine, but you're not going to play next year. And then the kid's like, okay, I'm going to transfer. And I'm sure the coaching staff is like, and we'll help you transfer. Like, we'll give you good recommendations. We'll help you find the next spot. Like, I'm sure they're very classy about it and everything, but that does happen. And it's not just a Kansas thing. That happens everywhere across the country in today's day and age, right? It's kind of the plus minus. Like, players have more freedom, but also the coaches have more freedom to do what they want with the roster as well. It's kind of the plus minus for both things. So he has to decide who he wants to show the door to, if anybody. And this mostly applies to like bench guys. I guess in theory, it applies to one of KJ or Hunter Dickinson. Do you feel comfortable playing both those guys as starters again, if both are willing to come back and saying, hey, do we think we can build a roster that has enough shooting and enough defense, even if we're starting both of them next to each other? Or again, what do you have to do with that? I think off the bench, the big ones that you have questions on here is with Elmarko Jackson and Jamari McDowell. And I think I forgot earlier that Nick Timberlake also graduated as part of that portion. But anyway, I think those would be the two big ones. And I think it's very easy to see Elmarko had a really bad year for Kansas. I mean, just in terms of like efficiency and lack of production for the amount of minutes he got, this is not hyperbole. It was one of the worst seasons per, 10 plus minutes played per game that we've seen in the Bill Self era. I don't say that to crap on the kid, because I think Elmarko Jackson is a good kid. I think he has a very high potential. I think he's a very good athlete. Let's not forget, he only played 3 years of organized basketball before playing this year at Kansas. And guess what? It's a lot easier when you hear those stories all the time. Well, not all the time, but a decent amount of time of like, this kid only played 4 years of organized basketball. Most often those kids that are successful that happens with are centers, because they're like 7 feet tall and they're athletic and they're big. And it's like, okay, just be big, grab, rebound, throw down, dunk. Like that's a little bit easier, right? And I'm simplifying it, but still, point guard is the most complicated position, especially for a Bill Self point guard, where you are asked so much, both mentally and physically. So it would make sense that Elmarko would take a little bit longer to get clicking and to get going. And so I would say, like, try to keep the kid, man. Like, I know it wasn't a great year and it was very frustrating watching it, but like, Bill Self has had more success with returning talent than he has had with new talent coming into the building, whether it's been freshmen, whether it's been transfers, right? There are obviously exceptions to the rule, right? You have your Josh Jacksons and Grady Dicks of the world who hit the ground running automatically right away. And of course, but there's a lot of other ones that don't go the other way, whether it was Nick Timberlake, struggling to put that together, Joe Yesufu, Charlie Moore. You want to go into freshmen, just think of the past few years. Like, okay, Elmarko struggled to get it going this year. MJ Rice couldn't get in the rotation last year. Zach Clements couldn't get in the rotation 2 years ago. On and on and on, right? So I think you're better off trying to develop these guys in a day and age where it's so easy to try to over-recruit someone in the transfer portal. It's clear to me, though, that Bill Self does better with returning players in his system. Try to keep Elmarko Jackson. Same goes for Jamari McDowell. And I think McDowell maybe profiles more into being a long-term role player, to where maybe that is gotten through his head a little bit more, to where maybe that one's a little bit more likely that he comes back. It is a two-way street. As much as Bill Self could be like, hey, I want both these guys back. What if one of them's like, well, but I don't want to come back? Then you're kind of shrugging your shoulder and whatever. But for me, I would not be trying to be like, hey, let's push these guys out the door and try to bring in, some transfer portal recruit to overplay them. Because you're still going to have scholarships available anyway. Even if you do bring back Elmarko and Jamari McDowell, you're still going to have like a handful plus of scholarships to use. So you don't need to boot those guys in. Like, you're going to have enough space to add what you need to add and add the talent you need to add anyway. I think that balancing adding more talent with not having more players leave, that's a big one. This sounds dumb to a certain extent, because with how thin Kansas was this season and how not deep they were, like, isn't it a little silly to now go in the offseason and just be like, oh, well, do we really want to add that much talent? Because what if it chases guys off, right? Because then you're back in this situation where this year. At the same point in time, we know it is a fine line between trying to add competition and kind of seeing that kinetic energy lead to someone else transferring, i.e. when, Hunter Dickinson joined last year. And then you saw the repercussions of that. Ernest Uday and Zuby Ejiofor transfer out of the program for KU. So how do you kind of play this fine line? Maybe it's by bringing in guys who are content playing a backup role like a Jalen Coleman-Lands or a Parker Brown after you've kind of filled the main ones. Obviously, you still need to add some, starter-level talent, but after you've filled those. Maybe it's not caring about it at all and just saying, hey, we're about competition, like KU football does this. We're just going to add the best players we can, and guess what? You're going to compete, and if you don't like where you were on the depth chart, like, that's up to you. Transfer at the end of the season or whatever, Maybe that's the best way to play it. I don't know. However he plays it, that'll be very interesting. And then, how do you want to play moving forward? Like, what do you want to most add it is a little bit of a ball of clay here for Kansas. Not totally that way because you do know you have DeJuan Harris back. And so they're like, you're not going to bring in another pass first point guard or a non-shooting point guard to play with DeJuan Harris. So like that changes it a little bit, but like you can go a lot of different directions with this. Part of it depends. Are KJ and Hunter going to be back? Because then it is a bit more stern of like, hey, we need two shooters. We need like a combo guard. I think either way, they need a combo guard who can create his own shot and make shots at probably the two to play next to DeJuan. Maybe another one to come off the bench. And then you need a scoring wing that you can play next to those guys. But do you want to play with, more of a post-up big man? Do you want to play with versatile 5 men? Do you want to play with 3 wings and a point guard? Do you want to play with 2 guards next to each other and 2 wings, or 2 guards and a wing and KJ and Hunter Dickinson? I don't know. There's a lot of different directions you can go with this. Those are decisions that Bill Self has to make. The last one for Bill Self here is any assistant coaching changes. After having a year like this, is it enough to maybe want to shake things up a little bit? Now, Bill Self and his staff has had so much success that is one down year, enough to be like, let's shake things up. And I guess you could say, well, they also lost in the second round last year, but yeah, that was Bill Self being out with the illness, and that was a 1 seed, and like you lost a close game to Arkansas. Like sometimes that stuff just happens in the tournament. This year is much more of an indictment on how things went than last year. Last year was more of just spurned in the tournament, right? And so do you want to make any changes? Is there something about how you've been scouting for games? Is there something about how you've been scouting the transfer portal or scouting freshmen or recruiting? Like which of those, if you do want to make a change in the assistant coaching game, do you think is most important? And what are you going to try to add to? Let's continue on KU women's basketball. Quick preview for their game against USC on Locked On Jayhawks. When you're hiring for a small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Finishing things up with this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, quick preview for KU USC, depending on when you're listening to this. Hopefully it's before the game starts, but USC comes in. They're the 1 seed, 27-5 on the season. They've gone undefeated against non-Pac-12 opponents. Kansas at 20-12, 11-7. It was a great comeback for KU to come back and defeat Michigan in overtime after Zakiya Franklin, knocks in the 3 that kind of bounces off the rim and in, and then the great response in overtime for KU. So they've won a tournament game for the second time in the last 3 years, but now you're playing the 1 seed on their home court. And 2 years ago, when you did that at Stanford, it was a close game at half, and then Stanford pulled away in the second half. I think now Kansas, 2 years of an older team, more experienced team. I think they're better suited to try to pull this upset on the road against USC, but it's not going to be easy. USC is a very good transition scoring team. Kansas, that's not really as much of their forte. USC also gets a bunch of second chance points, so this becomes a very important game for like Tiana Jackson to kind of dominate. But when you look at what has gone well for Kansas over this recent run over maybe the last 10 games, the offense has picked it up in efficiency. The defense has been pretty darn good in terms of limiting opponent. I mean, they're in the 93rd percentile over the last 10 games in terms of block rate. A big reason for that is Tiana Jackson, and they've been a much more together, cohesive defensive team. I think over this last bit of time, they're doing a good job of getting to the free throw line here. And this becomes a very interesting player matchup game when you look at some of the freshmen in this game. JuJu Watkins is averaging 27 points per game for USC. Samaya Nichols, who got a bit of foul trouble last game, over 15 points per game. It's going to be a really fun matchup. And, when you look at it for USC, they've been this great team all season long, but that doesn't mean they're impenetrable. They do have 5 losses. So KU playing with house money here, playing against a 1 seed. Why not? And we'll discuss whatever happens in that game on tomorrow's episode. We'll also break down a little bit more off-season stuff with KU, maybe lessons that they can take away, top takeaways from this season that was had for KU. We'll also get into some transfer portal targets for KU later in the week. This has been Locked On Jayhawks. Find our show anywhere you get your podcast and on our YouTube page. See you next time.